Good afternoon, and welcome to the Sonoma County Drought Update for Thursday, November 10th. Thank you for joining us today. I'm David Rabbitt. I represent the 2nd District in the South County in Sonoma County on the Sonoma County Board of Supervisors. I'm also a member of the Board of Directors of Sonoma Water. Sonoma Water supplies water to more than 600,000 people in Sonoma and Marin counties through its partnerships with 9 cities and special districts. So let's begin with a brief message for our Spanish-speaking viewers.
Muy buenas tardes y bienvenidos a la sesión informativa. Esta es la reunión informativa para actualizar al público sobre la emergencia de la sequía. Si está participando por Zoom y quiere escuchar la presentación en español, busque y oprima el dibujo del globo que indica interpretación y seleccione el idioma español. Para los que estén participando por Facebook, puede escuchar la interpretación en español en el canal de YouTube del condado. Para escuchar la versión en español, puede utilizar el enlace de YouTube que se encuentra en la página de Facebook del condado de Sonoma. Muchas gracias. Back to you, Supervisor Rabbitt.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you also to Ashley for interpreting for us today. This is the 7th in a series of monthly town halls that the county and Sonoma Water have hosted this month to give you the latest information on the drought and how it is impacting our region. And today, you'll get to hear from 2 influential experts who are shaping the state's response to the drought and conducting important research that is helping us do a better job of managing our water supply. Jeanine Jones, the state's drought manager, is here to provide a high-level view of the drought and how California is responding as the state transitions to a warmer and drier climate. We'll also hear from one of California's top climate scientists, Julie Kalansky, who will share some fascinating research into atmospheric rivers, which play an increasingly important role in whether we are experiencing drought or flood conditions, and sometimes both at the same time. At the end of the presentations, we have made time to answer as many of your questions as we can. There are going to be 3 ways that you can pose questions to our panelists. If you have joined us on Zoom, please type your questions in the Q&A box. If you're watching this on Facebook or YouTube, you can type questions into the comments area below. And if you are also welcome, of course, to email questions to our public affairs team at publicaffairs, all one word, at sonoma-county.org. So with that, let's get started. You know, it was wonderful to see the rain return this week, but I think we all know we need a lot more of it. As of today, we received almost 2.7 inches. That's updated through this afternoon. Since the new water year began October 1st, that 2.7 inches in normal years would have been 4 by now. And those are the most recent numbers we have to report, but they really don't do an adequate job of illustrating just how far behind we are. You all know this, I know. We probably know we're experiencing one of the driest driest periods in more than a century. But what exactly does that mean? Well, in a typical year, the Russian River watershed, all important watershed for drinking water, will get about 45 inches of rain. But over the last 3 years, we've only received about 26 inches per year on average. That's about 42% below the historical norm. But if you put that in a back-to-back dry years, our rain deficit has compounded over time. And when you do the math, over the course of this 3-year drought, we've missed out on 56 inches of rain that we normally would have received. This is equivalent to more than a year's worth of rain. And if you think about that, over these last 3 years, we missed 1 full year of rainfall. And that's why our forests are so dry and we face an elevated risk of wildfires. That's why wells in some areas of the county are producing less water or running dry entirely. That's why our largest reservoir, Lake Sonoma, has dropped to its lowest level since we began filling it with water 40 years ago. And it's the reason why we need to take action now, both to conserve the water we have and to invest in creating the infrastructure we will need to thrive in a drier future. As you will see today, we are preparing for the fact that our climate is changing in ways that will put increasing stress on our water supply. But we need your help, and we need to do it now to preserve water that we currently have in our reservoirs. If you haven't done so already, highly motivate you to go out and turn off your outdoor irrigation system for the season. Fall is a time of year that plants start to conserve energy by going dormant over winter. And as the days get shorter and cooler, plants don't need as much water as they do over summer. And they certainly don't need it right after it rains. And if you're watering your landscape within 48 hours of a rain event, you're not really helping your plants anyway. You are simply wasting that water. So remember, water saved now is water that we can use later. And if we don't get a lot of rain this winter, we're going to need each and every drop. Our climate is becoming warmer and drier, which has profound ramifications on our future. That's the subject of our first guest, who spends a lot of time thinking about. Jeanine Jones is our drought manager for the State Department of Water Resources. She is helping to develop the state's response to the transition our climate is undergoing. It is a comprehensive plan that would stretch out our supply of water by using it more efficiently, but also help us tap into new supplies of water that would otherwise be unusable. So Jeanine, what have you learned about this drought, and how is it shaping up the state's water supply strategy?
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and my apologies to the audience, but my Wi-Fi connection here is somewhat unstable, so I'm going to keep my video camera off so I make sure I have audio. So let's talk about what we have learned in this drought and how that stacks up with some of our past droughts. So if we look at this year, as the supervisor said, this has not been a great year, and it's a third dry year for us in California, and it follows a water year 2021 that was really extreme in terms of both temperature and precipitation. And we are really starting to see significantly increased impacts from droughts as compared to what we have seen in our historical record. And that's what is really giving us pause in terms of thinking about climate change going forward and how that fits in with water supplies and drought. Now, just to point out, it has been very warm throughout the country. Really in this century was not the record warmest, it was still much above average for pretty much everyone. And if we look at other key metrics, such as how are we doing in statewide reservoir storage, well, at the end of the last water year, and we define water year as the period from October 1st through September 30th, we did come in, certainly better than water year 2021, because this water year was a little bit wetter. And one of the things that we learn over time droughts is that also not be as good. So if we were at the end of in that regard. But really important point is that groundwater is a major 60% on groundwater, both cities and farms, as compared to 40% in a more average. And if we look at water level changes over just a single year, most of the wells that are in our statewide measuring network are, not showing a whole lot of change. But if we looked over a long period, 10 years or 20 years, we would definitely see a downward trend in much of the state, and especially in the San Joaquin Valley. And one of the impacts of this, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley, is land subsidence. And one way that we know that drought impacts are getting worse is that we are now seeing land subsidence in the Sacramento Valley, which historically was not the case. and it reflects a shortage of water supply because of the zero allocations, for example, from the federal Central Valley Project to its agricultural contractors. And this is one of the things that clues us into the fact that we are in a different situation now than we were in our past droughts. And as the supervisor mentioned, this is where you are looking at the North Coast part of the state. This past water year and water year 2021 were fairly close, actually. Whereas in other parts of the state, we did a little bit better in this immediately past water year. Now, if we step back and think about that we had not very long ago, the 5-year drought of 2012 to 2016, we had the warmest years then in the statewide record, and we set records for low snowpack. Only 25% of average in 2014, tying the record in 1977. But then in 2015, that was also the first ever zero allocations from the federal Central Valley Project, areas of dry private residential wells. So moving current 3-year drought, and the first ever Central Valley Project health and safety only allocation from for its M&I contractors, municipal and industrial contractors, and only a 5% state water project allocation. And for the first time, we have a declared shortage in the lower Colorado River Basin, which has historically been California's most reliable supply during droughts. So we definitely see that impacts are worsening in comparison to our river basin. This is like Powell. Well, it will in the to the right of that bluff in the middle of Lake Powell, how low the lake levels are. Now, we have a statewide drought emergency proclamation covering all of the state's counties and at these drought conditions.
I think we've lost you. We've been experiencing some audio problems here. Jeanine, I'm sorry for that. Wonder if we can get a telephone number for her to call in and finish her presentation.
We certainly were at the mercy of that internet connection, and I know Jeanine was traveling and not in. It wasn't a state issue because she wasn't in her office, but is she back? Ted, should we advance to our next guest and maybe circle back if we can?
Yes, I think that's an excellent idea, Supervisor Rabbitt.
Okay, obviously from Jeanine's presentation that you saw through the slides, Sonoma County is not alone, in California as a whole has been experiencing some pretty severe drought for the last 3 years, and in the history of pretty volatile weather patterns. It's interesting here in our own county that I believe it was in 2019, the year before the first year of the drought, we had record rains and flooding in the Russian River Valley. So we certainly are at the mercy of that. And the combination of those two, really, we're going to hear from Julie Kalansky, climate scientist with the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. The goal of Julie's research is to help us better understand those weather and climate so that we can prepare to meet the challenges ahead. She's an expert on atmospheric rivers that I think we know all too well here in Sonoma County, and she has some insights into how they may change in the future. So, Julie, what do we need to know about atmospheric rivers and their impact on Sonoma County?
Well, hopefully I'll be able to teach you some of that or explain some of that. Let me real quickly share my screen and I can bring up the PowerPoint. Everybody seeing it and seeing the right screen? It's looking good? Great. Well, thank you for having me. And as Supervisor Rabbitt mentioned, I'll be talking about atmospheric rivers and how they're projected to change in the future, and also how we're using forecasts to help manage water within the Russian River. And so first thing I think is really important to think about is how unique California is in terms of its precipitation. So what you're looking at is a map of the US, and each of these dots represent a weather station, and the color of the dot represents how variable it is year to year in terms of the precipitation. So how wet it is some years versus how dry it is other years. And so if you look largely on the East and Midwest, the total precipitation varies only slightly from year to year. Whereas when you look in California, it varies greatly. And so the darker colors are those greater, that greater variability year to year. And so some additional research has shown that it's really the big storms that matter in this year-to-year variability. And so what you're looking at here is a graph, and each of these kind of mauve brown color bars indicate the total precipitation in the Delta catchment area, but this is very similar for Sonoma Water or Sonoma Russian River watershed, the total precipitation each year. And that black line is a running average over 5 years. And then when you look at the green line, what this is all the storms that are less than the 95th percentile. So 95% of those storms are lower than that in that green. And then the red is those 5% or higher storms, so the 95th percentile storms. And what you notice is that black line really follows that red line, which this is really an indication that the large storms in California are determining if it's going to be a wet or dry year. And in California, most of those storms are atmospheric rivers. And so this begs the question of, well, what is an atmospheric river? And atmospheric rivers were named for what they are. They're rivers in the sky. And so if you can imagine, it's a lot of moisture and water vapor that is in the sky. And then as this figure is showing, when it interacts with the topography and sometimes other dynamics and lifts up into the atmosphere, it produces a lot of precipitation. And precipitation can be both rain or snow. Generally in the Russian River watershed in Sonoma County, this is rain. And atmospheric rivers can carry approximately as 25 Mississippi rivers. So that's a lot of moisture. And so you can imagine when it lifts up and produces the precipitation, it can be a lot of precipitation or a lot of rain. And this is just one example in the Pacific Northwest. When an AR that hit there, it produced 25 inches of rain in 3 days. So atmospheric rivers can produce extreme precipitation and flooding. However, they're also very critical to our annual water supply. And Sonoma Water in California has experienced this in recent years. And so what you're looking at here is from January, February, or March of water year 2019. And so each of these arrows represent a different atmospheric river. And the color represents how strong it is, with the purple being extreme and the red being strong, moderate being orange, and then weak being the blues. And the colors, what you're seeing here is a percent of normal precipitation. And for those of that you remember, in 2019, it was a really wet year. There was actually some flooding in Guerneville and in the Russian River watershed. So it was an extremely wet river, and you notice how many atmospheric rivers there were that year. In contrast to this water year during January, February, March, which was extremely dry. It was the driest start on record and over 100-year record for the state. And there was only one atmospheric river. And so this just illustrates the importance of atmospheric rivers in determining if it's going to be a wet or dry year. So, and then thinking about the more extreme side of it, we've looked at the center. So colleague Tom Cranham has looked at the impacts or the drought, the cost from atmospheric rivers as it relates to flooding. And so this is by county, looking at the average annual flood damages from atmospheric rivers. And as you can see, Sonoma County kind of stands out. And this has to do with quite a few different things, but one of it is the direction and the orientation of a lot of the atmospheric rivers. When it interacts with the coastal topography around Sonoma County, it can produce a lot of rainfall. And it's kind of a hot spot of where this atmospheric rivers hit. At the Center of Western Weather and Water of Streams, our director, Marty Ralph, with several others in the National Weather Service and elsewhere, have developed a ranking system for atmospheric rivers. And so, as I mentioned earlier, atmospheric rivers can be very beneficial, but if they're too extreme or stay too long and have too long of a duration, they can become hazardous, and this is what can lead to flooding. And the idea of the AR scale and this ranking is to help identify which atmospheric rivers are going to be beneficial and which have the potential to be hazardous. And so the scale is unlike the hurricane scale, which the hurricane scale relates to the entire storm. The atmospheric river scale is specific to any location. So the same atmospheric river could have a different rank at different spots along the coast, for example. And the way the rank is determined is by the maximum intensity. So how we measure atmospheric rivers in two different ways. One is the amount of moisture that's in it, so the water vapor, and then also how it's moving, so the transport, so the winds, which is called, what you see here is IVT, integrated water vapor transport. So the maximum amount of the components of wind and water vapor, and then how long it lasts. And then in these 1s and 2s, these are generally very much the beneficial atmospheric rivers. 3s are more dependent on the antecedent conditions, and the 4 or 5s are more likely to be hazardous. And so when the Tom Cranham, who did this analysis by county, looked at the AR damages by AR rank, you can see that scales, this is logarithmically by the damages in terms of cost scale by AR rank. And those in the 1s or 2s are mostly beneficial, whereas those as the 4s and 5s are mostly hazardous. So, and Tom also did this analysis using climate projections of what this means in the future. And so using the various different climate models, this gray here is showing a historical period in the climate models. The solid line is the mean of many climate models, and the shading is the range. And what you're seeing is between two different scenarios. One is more of an intermediate, and one's a high greenhouse gas emission. The red is the high greenhouse emission, and the blue is this intermediate. That, the annual expected damages are projected to potentially double, or under high greenhouse gas emissions, actually potentially triple by the end of the century. And so the question is, well, why? Why is this? And another study that was done at CW3E is looking at how much atmospheric rivers will change the overall contribution to total precipitation or total rainfall. And so this is a map showing that percent change of how much more atmospheric rivers will contribute to the overall precipitation, the annual precipitation. And so if you're looking near the Russian River and see these blue colors, that's between 15 and 20%. Indicating that atmospheric rivers are going to become increasingly important in this area for the total precipitation. But there's more to the story to that. And so this figure might be a little complicated, but I'll walk through it. And so what you're looking at is these bars are showing the different percentiles. So here are the much less extreme events, and at the end, here are the much more extreme events. And the actual dots here are showing, and the numbers are showing the change in annual precipitation that's projected based on these various different percentiles. So right around the median, we're seeing about 20 to 15% decrease in annual totals of precipitation based on these models. But what's interesting to note is what you're seeing here in these kind of light gray boxes is the non-atmospheric river precipitation, versus what you're seeing in these dark boxes, the dark gray boxes, is the AR precipitation. And what's what you notice is the AR precipitation at all of these different percentiles is increasing, these dark gray boxes. And when you get to these very extreme, the 90 to 99th and 99th percentile, so the most extreme precipitation events, which are atmospheric rivers, those are increasing the most. And so what this is an indication of, or the projections are suggesting, is that the most extreme ARs are going to even become more extreme in the future. So, and the next question is, so what are we doing about this, and how can we help mitigate some of these risks? Sonoma Water, working with CW3E, has been very innovative in thinking about new ways to use the infrastructure that already exists. And one of this is called forecast-informed reservoir operations. And the idea is that you can actually use forecast to help manage the water that's in the reservoirs. And this is something that's been ongoing. Lake Mendocino was the first pilot project, and it's now starting to work on Lake Sonoma. And I'm going to give an example for water year 2020 and how FERO kind of played out and how it's really helped. Even though this drought is severe, at least it helped a bit in going into the start of this drought. And so what you're seeing here is this is Lake Mendocino, and this black line is the water storage level. And so this is through mid-December. And this lower blue dashed line was where the previous guide curve was, or so where water in that couldn't go above, and if it was above that, it had to be drained. And this blue dashed line is called a FERO deviation zone. And so this is where, through this project now, water is allowed to be stored in this kind of blue shaded area. So then in January through February, there were quite a few big storms that came in. But by using forecasts, there was an indication that after these storms, that there weren't more storms coming in. And so the black line is where the water storage went with FERO, this forecast-informed reservoir operations, excuse me. And this orange line is where it would have been without FERO, without being able to use forecast to inform how you operate the reservoir. And so by the end of the year, because of FERO, there's been actually 20% more additional storage that was stored in the reservoir as a result of the forecast-informed reservoir operation. So the idea is really to use the latest information and forecast to help provide more flexibility that it both mitigates flood risk, but it also helps with water availability as well. So what does this mean going forward? So right now, and this is more of a conceptual diagram, but this is really important to think about with climate change and the potential for more extreme atmospheric rivers, but then also, especially with the drying out of the landscape with droughts, extreme droughts as well. And so the idea is this blue area is currently where the FERO space is. And then the idea of FERO 2.0. And that idea of FERO 2.0 is really this idea of how can we better improve forecast that they become more skillful, that we can have more flexibility in the reservoir to support, this extra FERO space. And so this is very much an ongoing research, and what we're working at Scripps is thinking about how can we improve forecast to help get to this FERO 2.0. And there's this is a combination of multiple efforts of improving observations, both offshore through a program that's called Atmospheric River Reconnaissance, where the hurricane hunters who drop instruments in hurricanes to improve forecast. At Scripps, we run a program that do the same thing for atmospheric rivers, and we've seen that actually helps improve the forecast of atmospheric rivers. Another effort is to have a model that's just focused on the West Coast and really focused on extreme precipitation and atmospheric rivers. And machine learning efforts have gone into this to improve those forecasts even more. And so there's a lot of effort really going on to improve the forecast, to think about how we can get to this FERO 2.0 space and increase that flexibility and build resiliency to climate change. So with that, I will wrap up because I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for questions. But just in terms of some conclusions, is California is very unique in that it has the highest year-to-year variability in precipitation. Atmospheric rivers are extremely important for water supply. However, if there are too few, it can lead to drought. But if one is too extreme or too long, it can lead to flooding. Atmospheric river cause almost all the flood damages in Sonoma County and increased by rain. And atmospheric rivers will become more important in the future, both for water supply and potential to cause flooding. And forecast informed reservoir operations, which is a partnership between the Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes, where I work, and Sonoma County Water Agency, to improve the water availability and also reduce flood risk. And the more improvements that we can make to these forecasts of atmospheric rivers, the more flexibility can be brought into water management to build more resiliency to both floods and droughts. So I will stop there, and I will be happy to answer any questions when the time comes.
Wow, Julie, thank you so much. I think our partnership with Scripps and yourself and Marty has just been wonderful. It's daunting to see that we're so reliant on atmospheric rivers, and at the same time, we're that one county that was the color yellow, I believe, which had the highest potential flood damage. So here we are, wanting to have those atmospheric rivers to fill the reservoirs, but at the same time understanding the consequences of too much rain too quickly. And it's Sonoma County has had that for quite a while, as our system is known to be very flashy, where we can suffer through droughts, and at the same time we can go quickly into a flooding period. So thank you for your work, and we look forward to continuing that, and I look forward to answering some questions down the line here. I do want to get back to Jeanine Jones. I think we have her a better connection, maybe a phone connection, and someone to handle the slides, because it is so important to understand the state perspective. And again, Jeanine Jones is our Department of Water Resources State Drought Manager, and we're lucky to have her with us today and want to make sure that we can hear her full presentation. So Jeanine, I'm going to go back to you, and you could pick up where you feel comfortable.
Okay, great. So we are going to start on slide 12. Thank you, Stuart. And so I had started out by saying essentially that in our droughts in the 21st century, we have seen that the impacts are much worse than what we typically experienced in the 20th century droughts. And as a result of that, we have greatly increased state response actions, including the water rights curtailments that I know people have seen on the Russian River system, and also many new financial assistance programs, including ones targeted specifically for small water systems and private residences who are running out of, have dry wells running out of water. And we are providing bulk and bottled water for these communities. And there are a number of grants that have been awarded in the North Coast area. Next slide, please. And for those who are interested in more history on California's past droughts, you can see these publications on our website, our Department of Water Resources website, including recommendations for acting in the changed conditions that we now have. And next slide, please. Now going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some details on the hydrology side of how our conditions have been changing. So as you can see, California certainly has a history with droughts, defined here as consecutive dry years. And the droughts that are indicated in red on this slide are the ones that have had the more severe hydrology. So if we look at the next slide, we can look at the change in the hydrology with time and looking at it in terms of statewide runoff. So as you can see from this graphic, it was quite dry in the drought of the 1920s and 1930s, as indicated by the steep slope of that smoothed curve line. But then look at the right-hand side of the slide where we are now, and notice once again we've got a steep downward slants to that line, but we're starting from a much lower base. And that is essentially what's been happening to our water supply. Now, why is this happening to our water supply? Well, let's look at the next slide. And what we see is that we are seeing a definite shift in our temperatures, and things are getting warmer. And particularly in the most recent years, every year has been pretty extreme in terms of temperature. So we went from, more or less normal conditions for most of the 20th century, started getting a few warm years, and then all of a sudden we got a bunch of them. Next slide, please. So we have a good idea of what our expected impacts of drought are. And the impacts that are shown in red here are the health and safety impacts. And those are the ones I want to be focusing on. Next slide, please. So one of the things we've learned in our past droughts is that large urban water agencies, because they have the resources and the ratepayer base to invest in reliability, they can manage multiple year droughts pretty well. Where we see the real problems is with small systems in rural areas and areas that are on fractured rock groundwater, which actually defines a fair amount of the North Coast hydrologic region. Next slide, please. And what we have seen in our last couple of droughts is that the changes that the conditions that we experienced in the past have been getting worse. And a couple of, good things. We now have Sustainable Groundwater Management Act implementation occurring, which will help us manage and preserve our groundwater, because that's going to be a really important resource as we think about what future droughts in a warming climate look like. Next slide, please. Now, this was the old paradigm in how we thought about drought. You didn't worry about it too much until the drought was well underway. Then you panicked, and then it rained. Everything was good. People went back to not worrying too much about drought. Well, we can't do that anymore because not only is that a not very good way to respond to drought, it's also not a good way to respond to the climate change impacts that we're seeing. And if we could switch to the next slide, we need to start thinking about drought not as an occasional event that happens once in a while and we do an emergency response action and then we're done, but we need to think about that we are experiencing new impacts, especially some of those critical health and safety impacts like wildfire risk increasing. And we need to transition from thinking about drought as something that happens once in a while to recognizing the fact that we are essentially in a position now where we can't count on the water supply that we've historically had. So we have to think about ways to be more resilient in a drier climate. Next slide, please. And I know this is a painful subject for many in Sonoma County because of the impacts that you experienced in the Tubbs fire, but we have definitely seen the fingerprint of climate change on wildfire risk. As CAL FIRE would point out, all but 2 of the state's 20th largest and most damaging wildfires have occurred in this century. And as a result of that, we are seeing kinds of distribution, kinds of impacts to urban water distribution systems that we simply hadn't previously experienced, as your communities saw in the Tubbs fire and others saw in subsequent wildfires, including as recently as last year in some communities in the Sierra Nevada. Next slide, please. So we've had 3 significant droughts in this century already. We're transitioning to a warmer and drier climate, And in recognition of that, the governor has released a water supply strategy for adapting to a hotter and drier future. And next slide, please. And we need no more reminder than our hotter and drier future than to think about the heat wave that California experienced in early September. Now, we expect Death Valley, Blythe, places in the desert to be very warm in the summer. That's not unusual. But look at what happened throughout the entire state, and especially in the Bay Area, where we don't normally see these kind of temperatures. So this is definitely a warning, next slide please, that we do have to be thinking about adapting to a hotter and drier future. And this water supply strategy has put forward a package of actions, including conservation, recycling projects, desalination projects that are intended to make up for about a 10% deficit in water supplies over the next decade plus. So this is the direction we need to be heading. And as I start to wrap up now, if we can go to the next slide, the question everyone wants to know is what's going to happen this winter? Well, unfortunately, the skill in NOAA's seasonal precipitation outlook is essentially non-existent. We do know that we are in a third La Nina year, which almost always means dry conditions for Southern California. And the upshot is, with just having had 3 dry years, we have to be prepared for a 4th dry year because the impacts could be quite significant. Next slide, please. And just to point out that NOAA's historical track record on predicting what the winter water supply conditions are like has no skill. This is a map that shows a skill score that meteorologists use to evaluate the skill of their forecast. And I'm showing here the 3 most important months for our winter water supply, December, January, and February. White areas on the map means no skill. So no more skill than predicting average weather conditions. Well, you can see that most of the map is white. And even the areas that have some skill, maybe get up to like a skill of 40 out of a scale that goes up to 100. So if you were in college and got 40 on a test, would you feel very good? No. So this is why, we can't believe the seasonal forecast. We simply have to be prepared for drying conditions. And if we could move on to my last slide, famous quote from a Supreme Court decision that some people may recognize, but we know that we have a future in which things are getting significantly warmer and drier, and this is what we have to now start planning and focusing on, transitioning away from thinking about drought as something that just happens once in a while. We deal with it, we get over it, life is good, but reflecting that we really need to increase our resilience for aridity. So this is where I wrap up. Thank you.
Jeanine, thank you so much. I'm so glad that that you stuck with us and we got you back, and the audio worked that time as well. Really do appreciate that. I think your slide regarding the fact that even as we sit in a drought, we should be planning, or we are planning for floods, and as we sit during rain events, we should be planning for drought. It's an ongoing work that needs to be done, and I'm proud of the work that we've done here in Sonoma County to be prepared. So thank you so much for that. And I know that many members of our audience are going to have questions, and I see some of them written in the Q&A box on our screen, and we'll do our best to respond to as many as we can. And I have Ted Apples with us. He's a member of our communications team. He's going to give you a quick reminder of how you can pose those questions for our panelists.
Thank you, Supervisor. As Supervisor Rabbitt mentioned earlier, there are 3 ways that you can pose questions to our panelists today. If you're joining us on Zoom, please type your questions in the Q&A box. If you're watching this on Facebook or YouTube, you can type the questions in the comments area below the post. You're also welcome to email your questions to the Public Affairs team. We're located at sonoma-county.org. We have staff monitoring that inbox who will pass along those questions to us.
Great. Thank you,
Supervisor
Chad.
Rabbitt.
Thank you, Chad. I appreciate that. Let's give the first question to Julie. And using your magic ball and all the research that we have to date, Julie, what's the likelihood that we can get an atmospheric river this fall or winter large enough to really make an impact, end the drought? And just how far out can we predict them?
Thanks for the question. So if we think about last year in terms of a really large atmospheric river, there was a large atmospheric river in the end of October. It was actually the rank 5 and produced a lot of precipitation. It was the highest one-day total for parts of the state. But as Jeanine shown and as we've talked about, we're still not out of the drought. And so it's not likely that one atmospheric river is going to get us out of the drought. You know, especially given how long it's been and how severe it is. And so it's the story of the water year, of how many we get, when they hit, and also how large they are. And so it's this combination of multiple factors. In terms of the predictability of AR, so generally, one of the ways we've looked at how predictable they are is oftentimes when you use a weather model, you don't run it just once, you run it multiple times, which is called an ensemble. And so you look within that ensemble, the probability of an atmospheric river making landfall. And we actually on the CW3 website have something called the landfall tool, and it looks at this probability. And there's been studies done to look at, if you get above this 50% of the ensemble showing an AR, then it's at 5 days out, it's very likely that there will be an AR that makes landfall. What can be a bit harder to predict is sometimes there are features that are attached to the AR or part of the AR that can cause it to shift farther north or farther south or stall. And sometimes some of these features are harder to predict. And so we know there will be an AR, but the exact location that it will hit or how long it will last, sometimes those characteristics can be a bit harder to predict.
Great. Thank you, Julie. Appreciate that. And maybe for Jeanine, you've presented some compelling data about the ways our climate in California is becoming warmer and drier. And how can we better prepare for the effects of climate change on our water supply?
Well, many areas in the state, especially the large rim reservoirs of the Central Valley, were designed the water facilities were designed based on the hydrology of the mid-20th century. And we know we're going to need to do a lot of work in investing in new infrastructure to respond to changing hydrology, because many of these areas are essentially living off of the investments in infrastructure that people's grandparents made. So we urge the public, when your water agency puts a Proposition 218 proposal before you and says, we need to develop the financing to invest in a water recycling project or a desalination project or whatever is appropriate for your area, we encourage people to realize they're not just doing this because they want to build things, they're doing this because we need to play catch up with where Mother Nature is now.
Thank you, Jeanine.
Supervisor Rabbitt, if I could just jump in here. Jeanine makes an interesting point that many of us are living off of infrastructure investments that have been made by our grandparents, and that we need to upgrade our infrastructure for the 21st century. I'd be interested in hearing what type of investments are being made here in Sonoma County to create the water infrastructure we all will need to thrive over the next century.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And as Jeanine said, a lot of systems were built in that same era, probably the 60s and 70s. They're coming to the end of their lifetime. And I think while I think we've been good about putting away funds for maintenance and replacement over the years, it's tough with rising costs. And it's really, quite honestly, a sensitivity to our contractors and what they feel comfortable charging their retail customers. So it's a delicate balance in general. You throw in, the volatile weather patterns, droughts and floods, and your systems get stressed and to the point where they are vulnerable. I will say here in Sonoma County in 2021, the Sonoma Water Board of Directors, we did adopt a plan and identified the infrastructure that is more at risk to longer and more frequent droughts and more severe storms, so that we knew where to invest those dollars wisely to get the biggest impact for what's ahead of us. And there is underway in collaboration with all local water suppliers, really a forward-looking study on the resilience of the regional water system, which will also identify those vulnerabilities as well as opportunities going forward, which I think are just as important. You know, I think one thing that I know that we've been doing as a state seismic safety commissioner, I very much appreciate this. We've been doing seismic upgrades for years now on our system, including where those large diameter aqueducts or pipes cross rivers and streams. The Russian River, Mark West. I think we have a 48-inch aqueduct that was re-engineered and reinstalled to make sure that it can survive an earthquake. And so we've been doing a lot of those work. And certainly, as you heard from Julie, on the other side of that is the whole investment in the forecast informed reservoir operations, the AQPI, which is the advanced quantitative precipitation information, the better weather satellites to manage the entire system. We also just approved increased maintenance budget this last year, which includes protection of our water storage tanks, which are vitally important. I believe the combination of the water storage tanks in Sonoma Water have about 128 million gallons. So we want to make sure that those stay in good condition. So there's a recoating project going underway there. So there's been a lot of work. I have to mention the bringing the wells online near the Laguna. One of the wells had to be rehabbed to allow it to be recharged with clean drinking water during the winter. So that water is going to be available during the summer and through drought. So picking up a lot of pieces. I think the water agency is constantly looking forward and trying to make sure that we're making the investments that are going to get us building a more resilient system.
Great, thank you. That's very informative.
Let's see. Why don't we go to, I know Pam Jean is here, and Pam is Assistant General Manager for Operations with the County Water Agency. And as you know, Pam, obviously Lake Sonoma dropped this week to its lowest level since we began building that dam in 1981. I just need to ask you, should we be worried, and are we going to run out of water?
Well, we are not going to run out of water anytime soon. We still have quite a bit of water in Lake Sonoma. It's a very large reservoir, thank goodness. So it gets us through multiple years, even dry years. But there is a lot of concern about the reservoir. As you said, it is as low as it's ever been since it started filling when it was constructed. And we are concerned for a number of reasons, not just for water supply purposes, but for the environment also, and cold water for fisheries. But our projections for the reservoir itself, unless we experience at least 2 or 3 more of these types of years we've been experiencing, we should be okay. We have some projections posted on our website if anybody's interested in looking at them. They're at sonomawater.org. We feel like even if we experience a year similar to 2014, which was extremely dry, we should be okay. Even if we experience that type of a year this winter, we will still have plenty of water going into next winter, and keep your fingers crossed that it rains again at that point. So if we even get average rainfall this year, we'll be doing much better at Lake Sonoma.
And of course, that implies that water conservation will stay at the levels that it has been, which we're very fortunate that we have a very, we've been doing a good job there, and I think saving up to about 30% on the conservation side of things. So appreciate that very much.
Yeah, our communities are really amazing. Everybody should pat themselves on the back. The response has been fantastic. And we've been able to meet the requirements from the state for reducing our diversions from the river. And that's because how the community has stepped up.
Yeah. You know, Ted, before we go to some other questions, I know that I saw one question come through, and I assume other people, because I've been asked this a lot, how we have development in times of drought. And you see some sizable buildings in certain areas going up. And it's a good question and one that should be asked. And I think there is here we have really a clash of statewide priorities. We have two crises going on at the same time. We have a housing crisis and we have a drought. I think, we don't have enough housing for people who live and work here. And Sonoma County actually has lost population since the fires. So our growth rate is actually not that large. And I will say this, as an architect and someone that's familiar with the regulations that are in place for new construction. New construction is very, very efficient in terms of its water use. And I think what's telling is, Santa Rosa, for instance, they're due to water supply planning and really aggressive standards. Santa Rosa's total water use has decreased by 14% compared to 1990, despite a 57% increase in population because of the per capita reduction going forward. We all, there will always be droughts, and during times of drought, no matter what, whether a building was built here or not, there will be the ask for conservation. And I think we just need to get into that state of mind that every drop of water is precious. I will also say, as chair of the North Bay Water Reuse Authority, we like to use every drop of water twice or more. So recycled water is a way to take pressure off the potable water system as well. And we do appreciate that. We have housing standards to meet that are state mandated, but also the right thing to do in terms of trying to make sure that we have people living in our midst that work here and aren't commuting in from counties 2 or 3 counties away, as we have seen over the years in areas throughout the Bay Area. So it's a delicate balance for sure, but rest assured the planning goes forward. I'll also mention the urban water management plans that are in place, and those are a 20-year projection with 5-year checks, and they also factor in the most severe drought and making sure that the water will be available for everyone, including any projected growth going forward. So with that, Ted, I'll turn it back to you and see if you can see some more questions that we should pose to our panelists.
Great, thank you for that, Supervisor Rabbitt. Let's see, we have been getting questions about that, so thank you for tackling that. We have a question from Sandy, and I don't know if this is a question for Jeanine or for Pam, but she's wondering how much additional water will we have to conserve as a result of the housing development that's in the pipeline. She's seen some buildings going up in Southwest Santa Rosa, that some multifamily housing units, and she knows that we're under some water conservation, they're voluntary standards now, but she wonders how much they might increase in the new year if we don't get rain. Jeanine, would you like to tackle that from the state perspective?
Well, I'll start out, but I think that Sonoma should also weigh in on this one. So from a statewide perspective, a couple things in play here. One of them is that currently we have a drought emergency proclamation in place in which the governor has asked for 15% voluntary conservation from the public at large, and also has directed the State Water Resources Control Board to work with water agencies in areas that are particularly experiencing shortages to facilitate that conservation. The other thing that's going on, and this is more of a long-term thing, is that as a result of the Making Water Conservation a Way of Life legislation that was enacted in 2018, there are new requirements being set for urban water use, and those requirements essentially direct water suppliers to achieve conservation goals in the urban sector that are based on per capita, or in other words, individual water use, and those goals ratchet down over time. So currently the standard that is in play for indoor water use, and this reflects just indoor water use, is 55 gallons per capita per day. There is a process going forward to reduce that number over time as a water conservation measure, not specifically targeted to drought. And the thought is that during droughts, areas that have supply issues turn to their urban water management plans, and typically in those plans, most agencies ratchet down outdoor water use or landscaping water use. So that's what I would say from the statewide perspective, but the question regarding the local development, I think, would be best answered probably by Pamela.
Great, thanks, Jeanine. Pam, do you have additional perspective that you'd like to add?
No, just a little. I would say that the question is about what's being built, but I would say that the more likely scenario for having to reduce water use even more is really going to depend on how much precipitation we receive in our watershed this year. And our contractors, the folks that we wholesale water to, they then turn that water around and sell it to individuals, residents, and businesses. The folks that we sell water to, we have a very prescriptive way of determining how much water is available to them in times of drought. And so we would go through the process of going through that prescription process that we have that's spelled out in our contracts with them, and telling them how much water is available for each of them. They in turn would then turn to their plans that they have in place in terms of issues with when there's issues with water supply. They have their own plans for each jurisdiction that they would implement. So depending on what we tell them is available, they then would turn around and tell their customers, mainly the folks on the call here, the residents and businesses, how much water is available to them. And it's all kind of laid out and fairly prescriptive.
And Pam, that's our water shortage contingency plans that I believe every city and every water supplier has as a way to respond to a reduction in water supply. And most of them, go through stages. So depending on how much they need to cut back, and how much they need to cut back obviously relates to the percentage goal of conservation. And so those are always in place, and I think underway as we speak in most jurisdictions going forward. So appreciate that. Ted?
Thank you. I know that we're at our a little bit past our 5 o'clock time. With your indulgence, I'd like to see if we could stay a little bit longer, just because we've got several more questions here that the public is interested in hearing about. Here's one from a resident in the Two Rock area. Perhaps Supervisor Rabbitt, this should go to you. This person wants to know if the new water line connecting the Coast Guard base to the city of Petaluma Water Department will be made available for the greater Two Rock community. Is it possible to add a new meter and a fill-up station so their water trucks don't have to drive all the way into town for water?
Yeah, that's a great question, and actually one that we worked on just last year. And in short, no, we weren't successful in moving that forward. That pipeline really comes from the city of Petaluma and the trainings facility of the Coast Guard base. And there's an agreement for the water service, and it does not include serving the unincorporated private parcels outside of the Trayson facility, as it's known. The Coast Guard maintains the line and the infrastructure. They also pay for the power to get the water up and over what we call down here Wiggins Hill, which is significant. And the added demand on the pump at the King Road pump station, I think, is also part of that and one of the hurdles to overcome. The Coast Guard's been great partners, don't get me wrong. In this particular case, it's just that particular pipeline serves that facility. They are always come to the rescue in terms of fire suppression and emergency and volunteerism throughout Petaluma. But we're, constantly working on that. And that's why we really turned to the water agency and the well on Todd Road to bring that online to offset some of that potable water that was being used for those residents and facilities and ag facilities outside west of Petaluma. But we'll continue to work with our partners at each and every level.
Great, thank you for that. Julie, there's a question about atmospheric rivers. Why is it that Sonoma County has such extremes? What is it about? Is it our location, or is there something else that makes us the poster child for the place that can go from drought to flooding in the course of a single storm?
I would say Sonoma County isn't necessarily unique in the fact that it goes from drought to floods. We see that in other places throughout the state, but it is a hotspot. And if you look at, historical data in terms of return intervals for atmospheric rivers, and it generally has to do with a lot of the storm tracks. And so what some of these studies have shown is the atmospheric rivers oftentimes were referred to as pineapple express storms. And these are storms that come from Hawaii, and just the angle of them and how they intersect with the topography and the moisture are often some of our strongest atmospheric rivers. And so that orientation of those storms is kind of a hot spot over Sonoma County and the Russian River. And so it has to do with the storm track and how that is aligned with where the Russian River and Sonoma County is.
Great, thank you for that. We've got a couple of questions about desalination plants here. If people are wondering if Sonoma County is pursuing those in any fashion, is that something, Supervisor Rabbitt, that you'd like to tackle, or Pam?
I know that we've had some discussions with our partners in Marin County and with our congressman about groundwater desal, where the may not be as severe in the brine that you need to dispose of if it's groundwater, where it's just a little brackish, and trying to make that into a potable supply. And that would be more so down around the San Pablo Bay area in the South County. So we are, I think, constantly looking at all options to make sure that we're looking over the horizon, and these things usually take some time. I will say this, I saw Wendy Krupnick put a question up regarding really the other work I think the county is doing great work on is, our Russian River system, as was noted by Julie and Jeanine, is so flashy, but we still have quote unquote excess water flowing in the wintertime. And if we can capture that excess water and get that into our system, at that point in time, we have a storage issue, and really to use the aquifer as our storage. So groundwater recharge is something that is being looked at, and there's some pilot projects already underway to see if we can take that water when it's available and bring it down and get it into the aquifer so that it can be pulled back up when the weather dries up. So that's another, I believe, something that's really a valuable investigation and pilot program going on that might be beneficial down the line.
Great, thank you very much for that. Well, we're now at 10 after 5. I think I see we're starting to have some people head out for dinner now. So any last minute thoughts or questions from the panel?
If I may, I just want to say thank you to our panelists, Julie and Jeanine. Thank you for taking the time and being with us, answering questions. And I will turn to Sonoma Water staff to see how the unanswered questions that might be with us will be responded to. But I do appreciate everyone's taking the time tonight, participating, providing that information. Stay tuned. Again, as I said when we started, this is the 7th drought town hall, and there will be an 8th, and unfortunately, and so on, a 9th or a 10th. But there'll be more opportunities to talk about water, and certainly the email address for Sonoma Water is up there as well. And you can also contact me at the County of Sonoma So it's David.Rabbitt, 2 B's, 2 T's, at Sonoma-county.org. And feel free to send your questions my way, and we'll track down the experts who can answer those and get back to you. But I want to thank you, Ted. Thank our interpreters, thank our sign language folks and our panelists and all our staff for facilitating really a great town hall. Appreciate it.
Great, thank you. That concludes the Drought Town Hall for November. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a good evening.
Thank you for having me.